So although it may be tempting when you go to the store and see all those bright, pretty bags of potting mix there on the pallets. What's up, Lazy Dog fam? Hope all y'all are having an awesome day. It is Tuesday, September 3rd here in South Georgia. A windy day out here today, but we're going to be talking about bed prep. Why is bed prep before planting so important? What do you need to add? And then I'm going to show you how we do it. So let me explain a scenario that happens all the time. Somebody gets a hankering to plant them a fall garden. They go to the local store, buy them some plants, or maybe they even planned ahead a little bit and grew their own plants. They also go buy them a nice big bag of potting soil that supposedly has some fertilizer already in it. You know, those little green granules that never break down. And they'll put that on their beds, put their plants in there, and then, I don't know, maybe a month and a half later, they'll wonder why their plants maybe aren't doing as good as they thought they would do. So today we're going to try to prevent that from happening, and I'm going to tell you what you need to add to your beds before planting besides just that bag of potting soil with the little green pellets in it. So we've got these two round beds here that I want to plant soon, and these are the ones that we're going to be getting ready today. Because now that the temps have started to cool a little bit down here, I've got mustard green planting on my mind. Now it may be a little bit early to be planting mustard greens down here because we can still get some warm spells well into September and even early October that may cause those mustard greens to bolt and go to seed. But mustard greens are pretty easy to replant even if that does happen. Now before we get these beds ready, let's back up a minute and talk about why we need to do this and how often we do this. So I'll start with how often. So I usually do this twice a year, once in the spring and then once about this time of year before we do fall planting. I don't do it every single time I'm replanting something in these beds. So a lot of times throughout the summer we may have 2 or 3 different things that we plant in these beds. It's not always something that's growing all the way through the summer, but I usually only do this whole amending process twice a year. And as you saw by briefly looking at those beds earlier, they're not in that bad a shape. We could pull a few weeds and we could stick some plants or some seeds in those beds just as they are. But what we're going to do today is going to give us a lot better chance at success. So one of the reasons we need to amend or add to these beds is just the simple fact that that soil in the raised beds sinks down over time. So we have to frequently, a couple times a year, replenish that and kind of top them off a little bit as they settle over time. Number 2, we need to replenish the nutrients in these beds. So as we're growing stuff in these beds, that process is consuming a lot of the nutrients in the beds. And also when we get heavy rains, that's kind of flushing out the soil a little bit. So we need to replenish that. And then thirdly, not only do we need to replenish the nutrients, we also need to replenish the organic matter in the beds. Here in our South Georgia heat, that organic matter can burn up pretty quickly within a season or so in that soil, so we need to constantly replenish that so we've got a nice base of organic material in our beds. So whether you're working in raised beds like we are today or an in-ground garden plot, 2 things you should always consider adding before planting are nutrients and organic matter, aka compost. Now you can do this right before planting, on the day of planting, but if you can plan ahead and do it a couple weeks earlier, I think you'll be a lot better off, especially if you're using organic fertilizers like we tend to do. So let's dig a little bit more into these ingredients or things we'll be adding to our beds today. Let's talk about the nutrients. As I've told you hundreds of times over the course of this channel, adding a pre-plant fertilizer to your soil, whether it's a raised bed or in-ground garden, will make things so much easier on you and set you up for success. It's one of those things you just need to get in the habit of doing. Always have some on hand and always put down a relatively balanced pre-plant fertilizer before you plant. If you do that, your chances of success are going to be so much higher. It's not going to guarantee 100% success, but for most veggies, it's going to put you right on track. So I think adding a pre-plant fertilizer is absolutely necessary, with the exception of growing okra and cowpeas. We usually don't add it on those two, but we do for everything else. In an in-ground garden plot, you could get away with not doing it if you had a good base of nutrients there in your soil, but in a raised bed that's getting flushed out so much by heavy rain, definitely need to do it in the raised beds. And then we got the second thing we're going to add, which is the organic matter, aka the compost. This is going to really help with nutrient retention, which, like I said, can be an issue in raised beds. So having organic matter in the beds holds on to those nutrients a little bit better, so they don't just flush out of the soil. And adding that organic matter or compost is really going to help with water retention in these raised beds, which tend to need a lot more water than our in-ground garden plots do. So if we can add that organic material, help those beds hold more moisture for a longer amount of time, we don't have to water as often. If we leave, go out of town for a few days, we don't have to worry about our beds drying out so much. Now, if you have access to a really good manure-based compost, or maybe you've made your own manure-based compost, you may have a two-in-one solution there. You may have the nutrients and organic matter all in one. What we're going to do today is add them separately though. So enough talking, now it's time for some doing. So before we can do what we need to do in this round raised bed, we need to get this irrigation out of here, which is pretty easy given the way I've set it up. So this particular setup that I use for my round raised beds, I call it the spider setup. There's probably a better name out there for it. And I did it this way so it was really easy to pull out of here, working them in these beds, and put it right back down. It all comes out in one piece. Really easy to pull it up, put it back down, and it's pretty simple. We just have some mainline tubing here and these little spaghetti lines attached to it going in opposite directions. So I'm going to start by pulling up my staples here. Need to get those out of the way so they don't poke us in the hand when we're amending the soil in a minute. And now we can just remove all of this at once. So I'm going to unscrew this connection right here at this T. Kind of wiggle that tubing off there gently, and we can pull the whole thing out of there at one time. Now we can do some work. So the first thing I'm going to do here is pull these few weeds. Looks like maybe a volunteer pepper plant, or maybe that's a morning glory. It's kind of hard to tell. And then we're going to start adding our nutrients. So I like to use this Coop Grow granular stuff here. Anything relatively balanced will work just fine. You could also take a liquid fertilizer like the AgriThrive we use a lot and do a soil drench here. Doesn't necessarily have to be granular. I just like using the granular in these applications, and it doesn't take a whole lot. Just a few handfuls sprinkled over the soil there should be enough for these mustard greens, at least in the beginning. And then once we've got that granular organic fertilizer down, I'm going to take my little scratcher tool here and mix that in a little bit. I don't know if y'all can see it or not, but we do have quite a few of these zinnia stalks left in the soil here. That's what we had in this bed prior, and we just cut those kind of close to soil level there. So still a good many zinnia roots and stalks. We will have to work around those, but I'm not worried about removing them because we're going to add more stuff to these beds. They shouldn't get in the way of anything. We'll just let them naturally decompose there in the soil. So we're just going to lightly scratch around here, not getting real deep, just kind of breaking up that crust a little bit and mixing that Coop Grow in the soil a little bit. So now we've got our nutrients added and mixed into the soil a little bit. Now we want to add our organic matter or our compost. And this is what I like to use, the black velvet mushroom compost. This stuff's pretty easy to find and pretty cheap. Now you could also use the black cow compost, the cow manure based compost, or another kind of compost maybe you've made or that you can get locally. I really like the mushroom compost because it helps these beds hold moisture a lot better. That's why I prefer this stuff. So I'm going to start out by adding an entire bag of this to this bed right here because it has sank down a pretty good bit. I don't necessarily need the soil all the way to the top of this bed, but I usually like it somewhere right around there. So we've got a couple inches there that we need to raise. So let's see how far this bag here gets us. And if we need to, we can always add a little bit more. That smoothed out a little bit there. Looks like, yeah, we could use one more bag by the time this stuff settles down a little bit. Alright, so 2 bags later, and I'm pretty happy with where that's at. By the time this stuff sinks down a little bit, we should be kind of right at the level where I want it to be. And that's pretty much all we have to do. We do want to make sure we keep this soil moist. We don't want to let it dry out as we're waiting a few more days to plant our mustard seeds. Want to keep it moist so that organic fertilizer down there can start to break down. Now, if I were planting plants here, I would go ahead and add my little spider irrigation setup back to this bed. But we're planting mustard greens in here, and I'm just going to scatter seeds over the entire bed. So we'll put our seeds down first, then add our spider back whenever we do that in the next few days. So amending your beds before planting is really simple. Don't make it more complicated than it has to be. Make sure you put some nutrients down, and make sure you put some organic matter, aka compost, down. So although it may be tempting when you go to the store and see all those bright, pretty bags of potting mix there on the pallets, I would say stay away from the potting mix. It's okay to use potting mix as kind of the general base of your raised beds, but I wouldn't use it to amend or top off your raised beds. Stay away from that stuff. Focus on the nutrients and the organic matter that's going to help you preserve those nutrients and also preserve a little moisture. Now, as a side note here, an additional thing that we have on hand that we could have added that we didn't add would be some worms and some worm castings from our worm farm over there by the barn. I've done that in the past when amending these beds, and I may add some of those here in the next few days. I wanted to keep it really simple on this video because I know most people don't have a worm farm, and just show you stuff that most people can find pretty easily. But if you've got some worms and worm castings, by all means put some of that in there as well. Not gonna hurt to add some additional biology to get things churning in there. So before you plant, take the time to amend your beds, preferably a few days or maybe even a week or two before you plant. Focus on nutrients and organic matter or compost. Try to resist the temptation to buy that brightly colored bag of potting soil. You'll be a lot better off by adding some organic nutrients and some organic matter to your soil there. That is what your plants are going to thrive on, not on that potting soil. So I hope you enjoyed the video today, and if your recipe is different than mine, let me know in the comments below. That way other gardeners can see it and maybe adapt what they want to do based on what they have available to them. And if you want to know more about that spider setup that we use for the round raised beds, you can watch how we put all that together right here in this video. We'll show you step by step how to make your own little spider irrigation setup for a round raised bed. So check that out, and we'll see you next time right here at Lazy Dog Farm.